Hello everyone, my name is Yunsung Kim. I'm a PhD student in the Computer Science Department at Stanford University, and advised by Professor Chris Peach, and today I'm here to tell you about the student Zipf theory, inferring latent structures in open-ended student work to help educators. So let me begin my talk with a bit of a story about Code.org. So Code.org, for those of you who don't know what Code.org is a nonprofit organization that's aimed at essentially teaching programming education or programming to students of all ages. And what's special about it is its curriculum that offers accessible and engaging programming exercise in the form of puzzles, like the ones you see here. As you can see, they use block programming to teach programming to kids. And several years ago, I think it was in 2014, Code.org had this initiative that I like to call the Smart Hints Initiative, where they had they already had millions of students respond to 100 puzzles, the kind that you saw in the earlier slide. And they essentially wanted to label every single unique response with a highly personalized feedback, like the one that you see on the right. And essentially they wanted to do this using crowdsourcing. So, you saw some of those puzzles in the earlier slides, like they're simple puzzles. How challenging can this be, right? Well, 2 years later, Code.org announced that they canceled this initiative and it hasn't been reproduced since. Why? Because there were so many unique responses. But, take a guess of how many unique responses you would see from these 100 puzzles, right? They look pretty simple, right? It turns out they have 11 million unique responses. Isn't that amazing? Well, I found it amazing because that essentially means for every puzzle there was an average of 100,000 unique responses, right? And that's very puzzling because you know for a fact that some responses are going to be more likely than others. And in that case, how is it possible that you have so many responses, right? So since these data sets are so massive, maybe we can take a look at the probability distribution of the responses and get some insight about open-ended student work. And it's been noted in a few handful of occasions that the student responses to these block-based programs or programming assignments follow or is close to what's called a Zipf's law. And Zipf's law is essentially a probability distribution where if you order the responses by, do you see my pointer? Oh, if you order the responses by their probability, their rank and probability have an inverse power law relationship, right? And this, the Zipf's law is parameterized by an exponent parameter alpha that essentially defines the shape of this distribution. So that if you take a look at the log rank and the log probability, that alpha is essentially the slope of this relationship. And what this means is twofold. It means that one, frequent responses are observed much more frequently than others. But more interesting than that is that rare responses as a whole are observed a lot as well. So that's why you had that exploding number of unique responses to these simple block-based programming assignments. And what's even more interesting is that we found that this Zipf-like pattern actually generalizes to several other domains and assignment types. So this is what we saw when we analyzed large bodies of student responses where we had large enough responses to actually see a frequency pattern. This means that for all of these assignments, we can essentially take a look at the rank ordering. If we are able to infer the rank ordering for each assignment and the exponent parameter that determines the shape of this distribution, we have a very, you can very roughly characterize this distribution even with these two pieces of information. So this observation leads us to a few interesting research questions, and I'll try to address some of these in today's talk. The first question is, what are some practical implications? We care about practice of education. So what are some practical implications of these patterns for educators and researchers? That's one question. The second question is, if they have implications, can we actually use this in classrooms? Can we infer these patterns in classrooms? It turns out it's a hard problem, a hard task. So we define what's called a Zipf Inference challenge, and I will describe the first Zipf Inference algorithm that we created called Semantic Density Estimation. And lastly, some theory, right? Like, why do we see these patterns in student work? Is there some, a deep grounding theory that gives rise to this? Well, my answer currently is I don't know, but we do have some hypothesis that I call the cohort hypothesis, which we will derive by drawing insights from a simple method or model of student thought process. Okay, so let's start with the implications. So how can this Zipfian patterns help researchers and classroom instructors? So the student Zipf pattern has an immediate implication for the scalability of analytics methods and algorithms. For instance, it's a necessary condition if you're trying to schedule human efforts for analytics, and that was the example that we saw in code.org. And also, it's also a necessary condition or consideration to make if you're trying to develop algorithms that can generate feedback or grade open-ended works. And this pattern also explains why it's so hard, why algorithmic grading is so hard, and you can't simply resort to simple methods like clustering to do this. And the exponent parameter alpha actually helps you anticipate the amount of unique responses because it determines how much fat tail, or it determines how likely you're to observe rare occurrences. And the Zipfian pattern could also be useful for classroom instructors as well. So they can use this to notice and anticipate common student misconceptions. So in this constructed example of a class on probability that you see, we get to know that many students are missing some important probability concepts, and we might want to address that during class. Also, you can use this to schedule pedagogical attention. So oftentimes the students in the tail would benefit most from a prioritized follow-up from the instructor, either because he or she has an idiosyncratic error state, or because that student gave a really creative response. Either way, students in the tail would benefit most from a follow-up. And in this example, the lowest ranked student seems to have issues with programming, and we might want to follow up with this student. And lastly, the exponent parameter can also serve as a metric of assignment complexity for the instructors. And complexity, quite admittedly, is a vague notion, but you can think of it as the level of individual variability in the student responses, or the diversity of the responses that the students give. And the smaller the alpha, if this alpha is smaller, that means that the shape is flatter in that log rank log probability plot, meaning that the distribution is closer to uniform. And that's what leads to a complex, that's what could be interpreted as a complex type of an assignment. So for instance, in the realm of block-based programming, for instance, this assignment is much simpler than that assignment, which includes slightly more complex constructs, programming constructs, which is even simpler than that assignment, which includes like nested for loops and variables and much more complex constructs. And you can see that these assignments are in the order of decreasing alpha. And similar trend also happens in other types of introductory programming assignments and across different types of assignments as well. So this measure of complexity can actually help instructors understand their assignments and make adjustments if necessary. All right, so I just talked about all the benefits of being able to infer these Zipf patterns, and can we bring these benefits to the actual classrooms? And it turns out that inferring this structure in regular classrooms is quite challenging, and you as teachers would probably know why. It's because even for a simple assignment like write a function that prints the first 100 odd numbers, like student responses are so diversified, and most students submit a response that's highly unique, and for that reason you can't even see the contour of the Zipfian pattern that I showed you from millions of students. And this makes Zipf Inference a non-trivial statistical inference task. So in our paper, we formally defined the task of Zipf Inference Challenge, and the task is to take in the unique responses from a class and essentially do two things. First, order them by their underlying probabilities, and estimate a value that correlates well with the ground truth alpha, or the ground truth exponent parameter of the distribution. Okay, so having defined the Zipf inference challenge, I'll now introduce our first Zipf inference method that we call semantic density estimation, and then tell you how we derive this method, right? So when students solve problems, you can essentially think of them as making a series of sequential decisions that eventually form the response. For instance, if students are solving a programming task, they might have to choose whether to use a for loop, a while loop, or no loops. And once they have that decision, they also have to decide, to run it 99 times or 100 times. So there's all those series of decisions. And for open-ended responses, each of those decisions get reflected in the response. So you can essentially think of each response, you can represent the response as this series of decisions that the students have made. And based on this idea of a student decision process, semantic density estimation stems from this main assumption that responses with similar decisions are also likely to be similar in probability rank. So if two responses involve similar decisions, they're going to have similar probability, right? And if we imagine that there's a vector space, kind of like BERT, right, where similar decisions are mapped to nearby points, two insights arise. The first one is that sampled responses will actually densely cluster around highly ranked responses. Why? Because nearby points, like I said, in this assumption, has similar probability, so they're going to be high probability as well. The second insight is that when the alpha is smaller, so that the distribution is closer to uniform, then the sample responses will actually spread out more evenly throughout the space. And it's spread out you can't really, it seems like it has fewer points, but it actually spread out outside this frame. And this motivates us to use the notion of density in this sample space. And each of these insights will help us predict the rank ordering and the exponent parameter of our underlying Zipf distribution. And that's the idea behind semantic density estimation. It's to estimate the sample densities in this decision space, so to say. And you can essentially define this decision space in various ways. For instance, you can use a BERT-like embedding space and compute Euclidean distances, cosine distances, or you could use a similarity metric. But regardless of how you define this decision space, we're going to use an idea called kernel density estimation, and that will give us the sample densities. Kernel density estimation is essentially a way of assigning weights to regions so that regions with higher observations or more observations get higher weights. And we evaluated this on a few 6 programming assignments that I analyzed before in the earlier slides, and achieved better rank prediction than simple baseline methods, and an estimate of alpha that is highly correlated with the ground truth. Now, just to let you know, we don't really have a foundation model or foundation embedding for decision spaces, and I think having that as an educational community would accelerate research a lot. But since we don't have it, we had to rely on a proxy metric, and the 2 proxy metrics I tried were cosine distance in code burst space and edit distance in this experiment. All right, so why do Zipf-like structures emerge in student work? I don't know. There's no definitive answer yet, but we do have a hypothesis, which is that it's probably a mixture of cohorts that may strengthen the Zipf-like structure in student work. And I'll get to that. I'll build up to this hypothesis through in the next 1 minute by drawing insights from that student decision process that we discussed earlier. But we're going to look at a much simpler version of this student decision process where you have a fixed number of decisions that are all independent, kind of like a multiple choice setting of high simplification, but still reflects to some extent how students make decisions. So you can think of every student makes T decisions, each having one correct choice that's sampled with probability beta that I call ability. and all incorrect choices are chosen from an arbitrary distribution. And what's important is that this beta applies to all decisions and all students in this model. Now consider a variability model where everything stays the same except every student has a different beta ability that's sampled uniformly over 0 and 1, like this. So the only difference is that mixture of abilities. So what you see here is the log rank and log probability plot for the fixed ability student. And this is for the varied ability student. You can see a clear linear pattern in this model. And all I did, the only thing we introduced was the mixture of abilities, and now we have a much stronger Zipf-like structure. So I actually believe that some form of this effect has been happening in open student work as well. Okay, thank you a lot for, thanks a lot. And I'll leave on this slide of limitations future work throughout the Q&A if you have any questions. Thank you.